Welcome everyone to this week's video lecture for History 3326, Modern African History. So, this week in the slideshow, you had a fairly brief slideshow to go through because we're also going to be looking at the documentary, The Language You Cry In, which focuses on tracing a Mende song back to a particular village in West Africa once it was discovered in the American South in the 1930s. This video should help to highlight some of the transfers that we're talking about on our slideshow this week. But just to walk you through the basics of what it is we're dealing with the Atlantic slave trade and African cultural retentions and transfers, we should first stop and take a look at the volume and structure of the Atlantic slave trade before we dive into details of these cultural transfers from Africa to the Americas throughout the Atlantic slave trade. So, first and foremost, volume and structure. When we're looking at the overall number of people moved throughout the years of the Atlantic slave trade, which we usually put between about 1500 and 1860, there are a number of different estimations as to how many people were moved. On the high end, you have certain scholars are saying that roughly 18 to 20 million people are being forced out of Africa and to the shores of the New World colonies and independent states. Most historians have revised that number, and they've gone back and said that seems like it's a bit of a high estimate, that West Africa could not have sustained that kind of population loss, in as much as the populations there just frankly weren't that big to be able to survive that kind of forced migration. Really, the best estimate that we have working comes from a historian who has looked at this issue extensively. This is something that in African history we call the numbers game, where people are arguing back and forth about how many people were moved. But David Eltis suggests that it's about 12.5 million to 13 million people. And that seems to be the most reliable estimate that we can go on based on the roughly 350 to 360 years of Atlantic slave trading. Now, what we do know for certain is that this system breaks down. You have two different time periods of the Atlantic slave trade. And in the first system of Atlantic slavery, we see that the trade is going to function on what we could call a south-south axis, meaning that slaves are being moved from Central Africa across the southern Atlantic, mostly to the South American colonies of Spain and Portugal. So this is the first system, and really we're seeing a very, very small number of people moved when you compare it to the overall volume of people moved in the second system that we'll look at in a moment. But the Spanish have an interesting system for slave trading. They are going to bar their citizens from actually engaging in the slave trade, meaning they can't sail to Africa, purchase slaves, and move them to New World colonies. Now, I want to be clear, that does not mean that Spanish colonies and New World settlements don't have slaves. What they're going to do is they develop something called the asiento system. And what that basically is they're going to outsource their slave trading activities to the Portuguese. So if you're a Spanish citizen, you ultimately are not allowed to carry on in the slave trade by law. But if you want to purchase slaves in a Spanish colony, or they need more labor in a Spanish colony, then the asiento system will come into play, and the Portuguese will be responsible from taking those individuals from Africa to the New World colonies. And really what we're seeing here is that most people are being moved from the Kingdom of Congo and Angola, basically that West Central African region we've identified, where today it sort of corresponds with Angola, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and the Republic of Congo. So the Portuguese are going to be carrying on that first system of trade for the most part, and the vast majority of slaves in that time period are going to be moving to Brazil. Brazil overall, when you look at it in the entire scope of the Atlantic slave trade, is by far the largest slave importer of any country in the Western Hemisphere. They are bringing in about 5 million slaves throughout the entire Atlantic slave trade. And when you put that in comparison to the United States, the U.S. and the modern-day borders of the U.S. are seeing about 500,000 slaves move into it over the entire course of the slave trade. In fact, all of the nations of the Caribbean collectively account for only 4.5 million people moved. So you can really see here that Brazil is hands down the largest importer of slaves in the New World. And so that roughly is going to describe the first system of transatlantic slave trading. The second system is going to shift the location in Africa that people are being taken out of, but it's also going to shift who is doing the movement of most of these slaves. What we'll see during the second system is that the British, the French, and to a lesser degree the Dutch are going to become responsible for moving people from Africa to the American colonies widely, not just the United States, but all of the American colonies. And they are going to be doing so from about 1700 to 1800. And really what we're seeing here is in this 100-year period of the Atlantic slave trade, this is an explosion of slaves. The numbers are going to go up. The volume is far, far higher in this period. And ultimately, it's going to be the second phase of Atlantic slave trading where the vast majority of Africans are going to be taken out of the upper Guinea coast and the lower Guinea coast. And the lower Guinea coast breaks down into the Bight of Benin. That corresponds with southwestern Nigeria, roughly, and as Benin and Togo as well, and to a lesser degree bordering up right there on Ghana. And the Bight of Biafra refers to what we would call the modern-day Niger Delta, the borders of southern Nigeria and Cameroon. So, ultimately, we're seeing the vast majority of people moved during this period, and this is going to be really where the slave trade turns from a trickle into an explosion, a real torrent of slaves moving across the ocean. So, that's volume that we've dealt with there. But structurally, what we need to talk about is ultimately, there's a few different schemes that Europeans are putting into place here to help them make money when they engage in this slave trading endeavor. The first that you need to be aware of is the triangle trade. What this is referring to is that if you draw a sort of straight line in the pattern that's going to be going on in trade here, it will form a triangle, where Europeans are bringing manufactured goods from Europe. They're bringing them down to Africa, and they're trading those for slaves. Once they purchase slaves with those goods at the African coast, they're going to ship them across to their colonies in the New World, in the Americas. While they're in the Americas, they will be selling the slaves in slave markets and then purchasing raw agricultural or mineral products. Those are the products that will then be shipped back to Europe to make the manufactured products that they will again sell to Africa. And this triangle keeps going around and around and around between the continents of Europe, Africa, and the Americas. Now, what's really significant about the triangle trade is it explains how Europe came to dominate the early Atlantic system. What it does is it allows European traders who are going to be carrying the goods across the ocean to maximize their profits at every single point of call. They are never taking an empty boat from one location to another, and they're ultimately going to be making money buying and selling in all of the markets at all points in the Atlantic. And so all of the wealth that's being generated from the triangle trade is designed, at least during the colonial period of the Americas, to feed the European economies. That's what it was all about. So that's what the triangle trade was set up to do, and it really is an effective profit maximization scheme for Europeans who are engaged in Atlantic trading. Now, that brings us to the Middle Passage. This is hands down the most horrific end of the slave trade. This is the one that you're probably almost familiar with the slaves being boarded onto the slave clippers in Africa and being packed into the holds of these ships. Now, profit maximization is another consideration that Europeans are following at this point. We're looking that overall, we're estimating it's about a 15% mortality rate in the Atlantic travels for slaves who are being forced into the holds of the ships and having to cross the Atlantic in conditions where they are chained to one another with almost no ability to move or any freedom of movement. They're lying in their own excrement. People are very ill. They're malnourished. This is hands down one of the most horrific experiences that anybody could actually endure. But the Europeans are going to go ahead, the ones who are organizing the slave trade, they look at the sort of cost and benefit analysis. They're looking at this very business-like. And ultimately, the conclusion that European slave traders will come to is that if they lose about 15% of their human cargo, they will absolutely maximize their profits. What it means is that they're overpacking the hold of the ship to just the right amount to where when that 15% dies overall, you're still going to be turning the most profit you possibly can in the New World markets. Having that 15% die to a European who's organizing a slave trade at this point means that you have put just the right number of people in the hold, and you're willing to have that 15% die because it means that you have overloaded the ship to just the right point where enough Africans are surviving that it's making it worth your while. And so ultimately we can see that that mortality rate is going to amount, when you look at the overall scope of the slave trade, to millions of people dying in the Atlantic. And what's interesting about this is after the abolition of the Atlantic slave trade in 1807, and that's something we'll be looking at in future lectures in more detail, that mortality rate in the Middle Passage, it goes up. And this might seem counterintuitive, as you have a number of European nations stepping up to try and stop the slave trade. In particular, Britain is going to really spearhead the effort because they're the strongest naval power in the Atlantic. What happens is mortality rates will go up because slave trading is now illegal. And slave traders, in order not to be caught with the evidence of slave trading, meaning the slaves themselves, the chains that are being used to hold them down, they're simply throwing everybody overboard. And so you're going to see that you would think that abolition would be helpful to those who are being shipped across the Atlantic, but in all actuality, what we're seeing is a rise in the mortality rate. So those are some of the structures and the overall volume of slaves that are going to be moving throughout the Atlantic slave trade. That just sort of gives us this big overview picture of how this whole thing's operating. Now, that said, the real main focus of this week's lecture is not about the misery of the Middle Passage. It's not about the overall number of people moved. Quite frankly, what it's about is something that Africanists are very passionate about, and that is African cultural transfers to the New World. For too long, scholarship has relegated Africans in the New World to simply being a source of labor. In other words, scholars up until very recently have been saying, well, Africans came and they were forced here under slavery, so they contributed nothing else to the society. Whatever was African in terms of their cultural fabric, their social fabric, they're leaving it all behind on the African shores. And because of the brutality of slavery, they're being forced to just simply act as their slave masters do in these New World systems. But as scholarship got more modern, as we started to challenge this view of New World slave systems, we realize that there is a distinct pattern of what we call ethnic clustering going on during the early years of the slave trade, the late 1500s and all throughout the 1600s. What we're seeing here is not simply a bunch of different African peoples being moved to a New World colony and then having to form a new identity as African in their new place. What we're actually seeing is that particular slave traders had an interest in buying from certain ports and then selling in other ports. So what we're seeing is a direct transfer of a certain ethnic group from one spot in West Africa over to another very particular spot in the New World colonies or independent nations. So that is a pattern we refer to as ethnic clustering, and as we investigate this more, what historians are generally finding is that throughout the first 150 years of the Atlantic slave trade, ethnic clustering has a distinct impact on the identity of people in these New World territories. And so what we're seeing here is not Africans. We're seeing Igbo people. We're seeing Mande people. We're seeing Yoruba people. We're seeing Angola people. So we're seeing different ethnic groups who can be easily identified when we're looking at this pattern of ethnic clustering in the New World. So with that in mind, there were three specific cultural transfers that we talked about in this week's slideshow. The first one we touched upon was the syncretic religions. And what we're ultimately talking about here is there is a particular religious tradition that comes from what we call the Bight of Benin. And that is Western Nigeria, Southwestern Nigeria, Benin, and Togo. These areas all shared a religious tradition. And that religious tradition is something that is referred to as Vodun. Now, this might sound familiar to you because when it moves across the Atlantic, these particular slaves are going to cluster into Catholic colonies, meaning the Caribbean islands that are owned by the Spanish and the French, and in Portuguese, Brazil, this is where we're seeing syncretic religions rise. And there's a specific reason for this. We don't see this in Dutch colonies. We don't see this in Anglophone colonies. And that is mostly because Anglophone colonies have a Protestant religious identity. The Protestants do not worship or show any sort of veneration to the saints of Christianity, whereas Catholics are very, very heavily invested in saints. Now, when slaves are coming over and clustering into these New World locations, this is going to give rise to the syncretic religions, because what they do is they have a system in place under Vodun where you have the ultimate creator deity and then a number of lesser deities that function for specific purposes underneath that creator deity. And this, for those of you who are familiar with Catholic saint veneration, syncs up rather neatly with how saints are viewed within the Catholic Church. So what the Africans who are adopting elements of Catholicism in these colonies are doing is they are sort of conflating together the Catholic saints with the old deities that they're bringing from the Bight of Benin. And this is going to give rise to a number of syncretic religions like voodoo in French New Orleans. And there's a number of different, it's Vodun, Vundun, it gets a number of different names in the Caribbean areas. We're seeing Santeria is becoming very popular in New Spain as slaves are moving into that territory. And things like Candomblé emerging in the Portuguese colony of Brazil. So wherever we see the population from the Bight of Benin clustering into Catholic colonies, that is where we're seeing the emergence of these syncretic religions. Next, the other economic and sort of agricultural transfer I want to talk about is that of rice agriculture. Now, planters were showing up right around the port of Charleston in South Carolina and also in the coastal areas of Georgia. They're looking at this terrain and they can't really figure out how to make it profitable. What do we grow here? What is it that we can turn into a cash crop from this area? And when they first initially begin to move slaves from what we call the Upper Guinea Coast, specifically the areas of like Sierra Leone, Liberia, these individuals already have a great knowledge of rice agriculture. They developed a lot of techniques to make rice agriculture profitable in their home territories in West Africa on the Upper Guinea Coast. And as soon as these slaves move into the coastal territories of South Carolina and Georgia, they look at the terrain and say, rice agriculture. That's what we can grow there. And it is the knowledge of the people who are being moved as slaves. It is their agricultural technologies that are being put to use in turning this area of the United States into a very, very profitable rice agriculture market. So what we're seeing here is that ultimately it is the slaves who are bringing the knowledge and the agricultural technology to be able to develop this area into a profitable colony and a profitable sort of export market. And so the reason that I think it's important to highlight these kinds of things is it is far too often that people will say, well, slaves didn't really bring any technology, and in terms of the economy, they had no say in how it went. But ultimately what we're seeing is in the early years, slaves are the ones who are responsible for bringing a very, very profitable trade into the colonial United States. So I think it is really critical to highlight those sorts of transfers as well, that we don't simply reduce African contributions in the New World to slave labor, because that's not all that's happening here. Next, and this is something that will be touched upon very heavily within the documentary this week, The Language You Cry In. That is what we call the Gullah connection, and it's a linguistic transfer. It's something that ties right back to that rice agriculture thing that I'm talking about. And what is happening here, what we ultimately can witness is the distinct movement of Mande people from the Upper Guinea Coast is going to mean that the Mande language will transfer along with those individuals and resettle itself in coastal South Carolina and Georgia. And there it takes on a new form. It's a language called Gullah. In this particular language, it's spoken widely in those coastal territories of South Carolina and Georgia. Linguists have looked at this language and said it is the most African language that exists in the New World. It takes more ideas and more concepts and more vocabulary from African languages than any other that we're seeing in New World settings. And so we're seeing that the need for rice agriculturalists, and the specific movement of one ethnic group from one spot in Africa to another spot in the New World is ultimately emerging in a new linguistic tradition in the United States. And this is the kind of thing that's happening in the early slave trade all over the Americas, as you're seeing distinct languages cropping up in different parts of the Americas based on who's being moved and from where. Another example of this that I highlighted briefly in our slideshow was based on a book called Murder in Montpelier. And the author of this book, Douglas Chambers, he is ultimately highlighting that Igbo slaves from what is now modern-day southeastern Nigeria, they are being moved in great numbers to Virginia. They're moving specifically from the Bight of Biafra to the slave ports of Virginia, and they are being used in plantation agricultural setup there. Now, what's interesting about a particular group of Igbo slaves who are living in this region of Virginia is that they are going to hatch a plot to kill their slave master. Their slave master is a guy by the name of Ambrose Madison. The last name might sound familiar to some of you. He was a forefather of the U.S. President James Madison. And so, ultimately, he was very brutal, very cruel to his slaves. And these Igbo individuals, they maintained their native tongue. They maintained their language from West Africa, and they used it to collaborate together. And they got together and hatched a plot to murder Ambrose Madison through poisoning. And here, again, they're calling not just on linguistic knowledge. They're hiding their plot. Nobody can find out because they don't speak Igbo. And it's the slaves who speak Igbo who are using the language to basically hide the fact that they're plotting against their slave master. And ultimately, what happens is they're also using knowledge of Igbo traditional medicines. They're going to use roots and things that can be found in the Virginia countryside to be able to concoct a poison that will ultimately kill their slave master. Now, unfortunately for the other slaves living in this territory of Virginia, is that it's going to ultimately, his death and his murder at the hands of these Igbo slaves will ultimately result in a crackdown and a passage of new slave codes in this territory. So the white populace of the area becomes very, very frightened by this slave plot. And they're ultimately going to crack down on the remaining slaves to make sure nothing like this ever happens again. But the important part of what we're seeing here is that in these early years, there is a distinct identity amongst the slaves in this area of Virginia. And that identity is one that can be traced back to a specific spot, particularly my area of expertise, Igbo land in West Africa. So those are ultimately the linguistic, religious, and cultural transfers we're talking about moving across the Atlantic. And again, the reason I think it's really critical to highlight this is we cannot reduce African contributions in the New World to slave labor and jambalaya and some of the cuisine of Cajun food that we're finding in New Orleans. What really needs to happen is a re-examination of the many, many contributions outside of just slave labor that Africans are bringing into the Western Hemisphere that's helping to shape this culture. We know that they've left their legacy on music, on cooking, on dance, on art, but it's also interesting to highlight when and where they're helping to build out the roots of an economy, when and where they're setting into place a religious system that people will follow for centuries to come. So, with that said, I hope everybody enjoys the film for this week, the documentary, The Language You Cry In. It's fascinating in that it's taking two sort of undercurrents of history and tracing them along the same lines to find a familial connection between coastal South Carolina and a very small village in what is now Sierra Leone. And also within that documentary, you're going to see some of the fallout from the Sierra Leone Civil War that will occur in the 1990s, as that's when the documentary is taking place. So go ahead on and access that on Blackboard under course content. And as usual, if you have any questions or commentary, feel free to send those my way. Take care.